Section 30 of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2nd, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 2 of 7. Knowing my own heart, and feeling myself, as I now do, superior to all the skirmish of party, the inveteracy of interested or mistaken opponents, I answer not to falsehood or abuse, but proceed to the defects of the English government. I begin with charters and corporations. It is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. It operates by a contrary effect, that of taking rights away. Rights are inherently in all the inhabitants, but charters, by annulling those rights in the majority, leave the right by exclusion in the hands of a few. If charters were constructed so as to express in direct terms that every inhabitant who is not a member of a corporation shall not exercise the right of voting, such charters would, in the face, be charters not of rights, but of exclusion. The effect is the same under the form they now stand, and the only persons on whom they operate are the persons whom they exclude. Those whose rights are guaranteed, by not being taken away, exercise no other rights than as members of the community they are entitled to without a charter, and therefore all charters have no other than an indirect negative operation. They do not give rights to A, but they make a difference in favour of A by taking away the right of B, and consequently are instruments of injustice. But charters and corporations have a more extensive evil effect than what relates merely to elections. They are sources of endless contentions in the places where they exist, and they lessen the common rights of national society. A native of England, under the operation of these charters and corporations, cannot be said to be an Englishman in the full sense of the word. He is not free of the nation, in the same manner that a Frenchman is free of France and an American of America. His rights are circumscribed to the town, and in some cases to the parish of his birth, and all other parts, though in his native land, are to him as a foreign country. To acquire a residence in these, he must undergo a local naturalization by purchase, or he is forbidden or expelled the place. This species of feudality is kept up to aggrandize the corporations at the ruin of towns, and the effect is visible. The generality of corporation towns are in a state of solitary decay, and prevented from further ruin only by some circumstance in their situation, such as a navigable river, or a plentiful surrounding country. As population is one of the chief sources of wealth, for without it land itself has no value, everything which operates to prevent it must lessen the value of property. And as corporations have not only this tendency, but directly this effect, they cannot but be injurious. If any policy were to be followed, instead of that of general freedom, to every person to settle where he choose, as in France or America, it would be more consistent to give encouragement to newcomers than to preclude their admission by exacting premiums from them. The persons most immediately interested in the abolition of corporations are the inhabitants of the towns where corporations are established. The instances of Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield show, by contrast, the injuries which those Gothic institutions are to property and commerce. A few examples may be found, such as that of London, whose natural and commercial advantage, owing to its situation on the Thames, is capable of bearing up against the political evils of a corporation. But in almost all other cases, the fatality is too visible to be doubted or denied. Though the whole nation is not so directly affected by the depression of property in corporation towns as the inhabitants themselves, it partakes of the consequence. By lessening the value of property, the quantity of national commerce is curtailed. Every man is a customer in proportion to his ability, and as all parts of a nation trade with each other, whatever affects any of the parts must necessarily communicate to the whole. As one of the houses of the English Parliament is, in a great measure, made up of elections from these corporations, and as it is unnatural that a pure stream should flow from a foul fountain, its vices are but a continuation of the vices of its origin. A man of moral honour and good political principles cannot submit to the mean drudgery and disgraceful arts by which such elections are carried. To be a successful candidate, he must be destitute of the qualities that constitute a just legislator, and being thus disciplined to corruption by the mode of entering into Parliament, it is not to be expected that the representative should be better than the man. Mr. Burke, in speaking of the English representation, has advanced as bold a challenge as ever was given in the days of chivalry. Our representation, says he, quote, has been found perfectly adequate to all the purposes for which a representation of the people can be desired or devised. Unquote. I defy, continues he, quote, the enemies of our Constitution to show the contrary. Unquote. This declaration from a man who has been in constant opposition to all the measures of Parliament the whole of his political life, a year or two excepted, is most extraordinary, and comparing him with himself admits of no other alternative than that he acted against his judgment as a member, or has declared contrary to it as an author. But it is not in the representation only that the defects lie, and therefore I proceed in the next place to the aristocracy. What is called the House of Peers is constituted on a ground very similar to that against which there is no law in other cases. It amounts to a combination of persons in one common interest. No better reason can be given why a House of Legislation should be composed entirely of men whose occupation consists in letting landed property, than why it should be composed of those who hire, or of brewers, or bakers, or any other separate class of men. Mr. Burke calls this House, quote, the great ground and pillar of security to the landed interest. Unquote. Let us examine this idea. What pillar of security does the landed interest require more than any other interest in the state, or what right has it to a distinct and separate representation from the general interest of a nation? The only use to be made of this power, and which it always has made, is to ward off taxes from itself and throw the burthen upon those articles of consumption by which itself would be least affected. That this has been the consequence, and will always be the consequence, of constructing governments on combinations is evident with respect to England from the history of its taxes. Notwithstanding taxes have increased and multiplied upon every article of common consumption, the land tax, which more particularly affects this pillar, has diminished. In 1778, the amount of land tax was £1,950,000, which is £500,000 less than it produced almost 100 years ago. Notwithstanding the rentals are in many instances doubled since that period. Before the coming of the Hanoverians, the taxes were divided in nearly equal proportions between the land and articles of consumption, the land bearing rather the largest share. But since that era, nearly 13 millions annually of new taxes have been thrown upon consumption, the consequence of which has been a constant increase in the number and wretchedness of the poor, and in the amount of the poor rates. Yet here again the burthen does not fall in equal proportions on the aristocracy with the rest of the community. Their residences, whether in town or country, are not mixed with the habitations of the poor. They live apart from distress and the expense of relieving it. It is in manufacturing towns and labouring villages that those burthens press the heaviest, in many of which it is one class of poor supporting another. Several of the most heavy and productive taxes are so contrived as to give an exemption to this pillar, thus standing in its own defence. The tax upon beer brewed for sale does not affect the aristocracy, who brew their own beer free from this duty. It falls only on those who have not conveniency or ability to brew, and who must purchase it in small quantities. But what will mankind think of the justice of taxation when they know that this tax alone, from which the aristocracy are from circumstances exempt, is nearly equal to the whole of the land tax, being in the year 1788, and it is not less now, £1,666,152, and with its proportion of the taxes on malt and hops, it exceeds it. That a single article, thus partially consumed, and that chiefly by the working part, should be subject to a tax equal to that on the whole rental of a nation, is perhaps a fact not to be paralleled in the histories of revenues. This is one of the circumstances resulting from a house of legislation composed on the ground of a combination of common interest. For whatever their separate politics as to parties may be, in this they are united. Whether a combination acts to raise the price of any article for sale or rate of wages, or whether it acts to throw taxes from itself upon another class of the community, the principle and the effect are the same, and if the one be illegal, it will be difficult to show that the other ought to exist. It is no use to say that taxes are first proposed in the House of Commons, for as the other house has always a negative, it can always defend itself, and it would be ridiculous to suppose that its acquiescence in the measures to be proposed were not understood beforehand. Besides which, it has obtained so much influence by borough traffic, and so many of its relations and connections are distributed on both sides the Commons, as to give it, besides an absolute negative in one house, a preponderancy in the other, in all matters of common concern. It is difficult to discover what is meant by the landed interest, if it does not mean a combination of aristocratical landholders opposing their own pecuniary interest to that of the farmer, and every branch of trade, commerce, and manufacture. In all other respects, it is the only interest that needs no partial protection. It enjoys the general protection of the world. Every individual, high or low, is interested in the fruits of the earth. Men, women, and children of all ages and degrees will turn out to assist the farmer, rather than a harvest should not be got in, and they will not act thus by any other property. It is the only one for which the common prayer of mankind is put up, and the only one that can never fail from the want of means. It is the interest not of the policy but of the existence of man, and when it ceases he must cease to be. No other interest in a nation stands on the same united support. Commerce, manufactures, arts, sciences, and everything else compared with this are supported but in parts. Their prosperity or their decay has not the same universal influence. When the valleys laugh and sing, it is not the farmer only, but all creation that rejoice. It is a prosperity that excludes all envy, and this cannot be said of anything else. Why then does Mr. Burke talk of his House of Peers as the pillar of the landed interest? Were that pillar to sink into the earth, the same landed property would continue, and the same ploughing, sowing, and reaping would go on. The aristocracy are not the farmers who work the land and raise the produce, but are the mere consumers of the rent, and when compared with the active world are the drones, a seraglio of males, who neither collect the honey nor form the hive, but exist only for lazy enjoyment. Mr. Burke, in his first essay, called aristocracy, quote, "the Corinthian capital of polished society," unquote. Towards completing the figure, he has now added the pillar, but still the base is wanting, and whenever a nation choose to act as Samson, not blind but bold, down will go the temple of Dagon, the lords, and the Philistines. End of Part 2, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 2 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Section 31 of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 3 of 7. If a house of legislation is to be composed of men of one class for the purpose of protecting a distinct interest, all the other interests should have the same. The inequality, as well as the burthen of taxation, arises from admitting it in one case and not in all. Had there been a house of farmers, there had been no game laws, or a house of merchants and manufacturers. The taxes had neither been so unequal nor so excessive. It is from the power of taxation being in the hands of those who can throw so great a part of it from their own shoulders that it has raged without a check. Men of small or moderate estates are more injured by the taxes being thrown on articles of consumption than they are eased by warding it from landed property, for the following reasons. First, they consume more of the productive taxable articles in proportion to their property than those of large estates. Secondly, their residence is chiefly in towns, and their property in houses, and the increase of the poor rates, occasioned by taxes on consumption, is in much greater proportion than the land tax has been favoured. In Birmingham, the poor rates are not less than 7 shillings in the pound. From this, as is already observed, the aristocracy are in a great measure exempt. These are but a part of the mischiefs flowing from the wretched scheme of a House of Peers. As a combination, it can always throw a considerable portion of taxes from itself, and as an hereditary house, accountable to nobody, it resembles a rotten borough, whose consent is to be courted by interest. There are but few of its members who are not in some mode or other participators or disposers of the public money. One turns a candle holder, or a lord in waiting, another a lord of the bedchamber, a groom of the stole, or any insignificant nominal office to which a salary is annexed, paid out of the public taxes, and which avoids the direct appearance of corruption. Such situations are derogatory to the character of man, and where they can be submitted to, honour cannot reside. To all these are to be added the numerous dependents, the long list of younger branches and distant relations, who are to be provided for at the public expense. In short, were an estimation to be made of the charge of aristocracy to a nation, it will be found nearly equal to that of supporting the poor. The Duke of Richmond alone, and there are cases similar to his, takes away as much for himself as would maintain 2,000 poor and aged persons. Is it then any wonder that under such a system of government, taxes and rates have multiplied to their present extent? In stating these matters, I speak an open and disinterested language, dictated by no passion but that of humanity. To me, who have not only refused offers because I thought them improper, but have declined rewards I might with reputation have accepted, it is no wonder that meanness and imposition appear disgustful. Independence is my happiness, and I view things as they are, without regard to place or person. My country is the world, and my religion is to do good. Mr. Burke, in speaking of the aristocratical law of primogeniture, says, quote, "It is the standing law of our landed inheritance, and which, without question, has a tendency, and I think," continues he, "a happy tendency to preserve a character of weight and consequence." Unquote. Mr. Burke may call this law what he pleases, but humanity and impartial reflection will denounce it as a law of brutal injustice. We are not accustomed to the daily practice, and did we only hear of it as the law of some distant part of the world, we should conclude that the legislators of such countries had not arrived at a state of civilization. As to its preserving a character of weight and consequence, the case appears to me directly the reverse. It is an attaint upon character, a sort of privateering on family property. It may have weight among dependent tenants, but it gives none on a scale of national and much less of universal character. Speaking for myself, my parents were not able to give me a shilling beyond what they gave me in education, and to do this they distressed themselves. Yet I possess more of what is called consequence in the world than any one in Mr. Burke's catalogue of aristocrats. Having thus glanced at some of the defects of the two Houses of Parliament, I proceed to what is called the Crown, upon which I shall be very concise. It signifies a nominal office of £1,000,000 sterling a year, the business of which consists in receiving the money. Whether the person be wise or foolish, sane or insane, a native or a foreigner, matters not. Every ministry acts upon the same idea that Mr. Burke writes, namely, that the people must be hoodwinked and held in superstitious ignorance by some bugbear or other, and what is called the Crown answers this purpose, and therefore it answers all the purposes to be expected from it. This is more than can be said of the other two branches. The hazard to which this office is exposed in all countries is not from anything that can happen to the man, but from what may happen to the nation, the danger of its coming to its senses. It has been customary to call the Crown the executive power, and the custom is continued though the reason has ceased. It was called the executive because the person whom it signified used formerly to act in the character of a judge, in administering or executing the laws. The tribunals were then a part of the court. The power, therefore, which is now called the judicial, is what was called the executive, and consequently one or other of the terms is redundant, and one of the offices useless. When we speak of the Crown now, it means nothing. It signifies neither a judge nor a general. Besides which, it is the laws that govern, and not the man. The old terms are kept up to give an appearance of consequence to empty forms, and the only effect they have is that of increasing expenses. Before I proceed to the means of rendering governments more conducive to the general happiness of mankind than they are at present, it will not be improper to take a review of the progress of taxation in England. It is a general idea that when taxes are once laid on, they are never taken off. However true this may have been of late, it was not always so. Either, therefore, the people of former times were more watchful over government than those of the present, or government was administered with less extravagance. It is now 700 years since the Norman Conquest and the establishment of what is called the Crown. Taking this portion of time in 7 separate periods of 100 years each, the amount of the annual taxes at each period will be as follows. Annual taxes levied by William the Conqueror beginning in the year 1066, £400,000. Annual taxes at 100 years from the Conquest, 1166, 200,000. Annual taxes at 200 years from the Conquest, 1266, 150,000. Annual taxes at 300 years from the Conquest, 1366, 130,000. Annual taxes at 400 years from the Conquest, 1466, 100,000. These statements and those which follow are taken from Sir John Sinclair's History of the Revenue, by which it appears that taxes continued decreasing for 400 years, at the expiration of which time they were reduced 3/4, viz. from £400,000 to £100,000. The people of England of the present day have a traditionary and historical idea of the bravery of their ancestors. But whatever their virtues or their vices might have been, they certainly were a people who would not be imposed upon, and who kept governments in awe as to taxation, if not as to principle. Though they were not able to expel the monarchical usurpation, they restricted it to a republican economy of taxes. Let us now review the remaining 300 years. Annual amount of taxes at 500 years from the Conquest, 1566, 500,000. 600 years in the conquest, 1666, 1,800,000. The present time, 1791, 17 million. The difference between the first 400 years and the last 3 is so astonishing as to warrant an opinion that the national character of the English has changed. It would have been impossible to have dragooned the former English into the excess of taxation that now exists, and when it is considered that the pay of the army, the navy, and of all the revenue officers is the same now as it was about 100 years ago, when the taxes were not above a 10th part of what they are at present, it appears impossible to account for the enormous increase and expenditure on any other ground than extravagance, corruption, and intrigue. With the Revolution of 1688, and more so since the Hanover succession, came the destructive system of continental intrigues, and the rage for foreign wars and foreign dominion, systems of such secure mystery that the expenses admit of no accounts. A single line stands for millions. To what excess taxation might have extended had not the French Revolution contributed to break up the system and put an end to pretences is impossible to say. Viewed as that revolution ought to be, as the fortunate means of lessening the load of taxes of both countries, it is of as much importance to England as to France, and, if properly improved to all the advantages of which it is capable, and to which it leads, deserves as much celebration in one country as the other. In pursuing this subject, I shall begin with the matter that first presents itself, that of lessening the burthen of taxes, and shall then add such matter and propositions respecting the 3 countries of England, France, and America, as the present prospect of things appears to justify. I mean an alliance of the 3 for the purposes that will be mentioned in their proper place. What has happened may happen again. By the statement before shown of the progress of taxation, it has seen that taxes have been lessened to a 4th part of what they had formerly been. Though the present circumstances do not admit of the same reduction, yet they admit of such a beginning as may accomplish that end in less time than in the former case. The amount of taxes for the year ending at Michaelmas 1788 was as follows: land tax £1,950,000, customs £3,789,274, excise, including old and new malt, £6,751,727. Stamps, £1,278,214. Miscellaneous taxes and incidents, £1,803,755. Total, £15,572,755. Since the year 1788, upwards of 1,000,000 new taxes have been laid on, besides the produce of the lotteries, and as the taxes have in general been more productive since than before, the amount may be taken in round numbers at £17,000,000. The expense of collection and the drawbacks, which together amount to nearly 2 millions, are paid out of the gross amount, and the above is the net sum paid into the exchequer. This sum of 17 millions is applied to 2 different purposes, the one to pay the interest of the national debt, the other to the current expenses of each year. About 9 millions are appropriated to the former, and the remainder being nearly 8 millions to the latter. As to the million said to be applied to the reduction of the debt, it is so much like paying with one hand and taking out with the other as not to merit much notice. It happened, fortunately for France, that she possessed national domains for paying off her debt, and thereby lessening her taxes. But as this is not the case with England, her reduction of taxes can only take place by reducing the current expenses, which may now be done to the amount of 4 or 5 millions annually, as will hereafter appear. When this is accomplished, it will more than counterbalance the enormous charge of the American war, and the saving will be from the same source from whence the evil arose. As to the national debt, however heavy the interest may be in taxes, yet, as it serves to keep alive a capital useful to commerce, it balances by its effects a considerable part of its own weight. And as the quantity of gold and silver is, by some means or other, short of its proper proportion, being not more than 20 millions, whereas it should be 60, foreign intrigue, foreign wars, foreign dominions will in a great measure account for the deficiency, it would, besides the injustice, be bad policy to extinguish a capital that serves to supply that defect. But with respect to the current expense, whatever is saved therefrom is gain. The excess may serve to keep corruption alive, but it has no reaction on credit and commerce like the interest of the debt. It is now very probable that the English government, I do not mean the nation, is unfriendly to the French Revolution. Whatever serves to expose the intrigue and lessen the influence of courts by lessening taxation will be unwelcome to those who feed upon the spoil. Whilst the clamour of French intrigue, arbitrary power, popery, and wooden shoes could be kept up, the nation was easily allured and alarmed into taxes. Those days are now past. Deception, it is to be hoped, has reaped its last harvest, and better times are in prospect for both countries and for the world. Taking it for granted that an alliance may be formed between England, France, and America for the purposes hereafter to be mentioned, the national expenses of France and England may consequently be lessened. The same fleets and armies will no longer be necessary to either, and the reduction can be made ship for ship on each side. But to accomplish these objects, the governments must necessarily be fitted to a common and correspondent principle. Confidence can never take place while a hostile disposition remains in either, or where mystery and secrecy on one side is opposed to candour and openness on the other. These matters admitted, the national expenses might be put back, for the sake of a precedent, to what they were at some period when France and England were not enemies. This consequently must be prior to the Hanover succession, and also to the Revolution of 1688. The first instance that presents itself antecedent to those dates is in the very wasteful and profligate times of Charles II, at which time England and France acted as allies. If I have chosen a period of great extravagance, it will serve to show modern extravagance in a still worse light, especially as the pay of the navy, the army, and the revenue officers has not increased since that time. The peace establishment was then as follows. See Sir John Sinclair's History of the Revenue. Navy, £300,000. Army, 212,000. Ordnance, 40,000. Civil list, 462,115. Total, £1,014,115. The Parliament, however, settled the whole annual peace establishment at £1,200,000. If we go back to the time of Elizabeth, the amount of all the taxes was but £500,000. Yet the nation sees nothing during that period that reproaches it with want of consequence. All circumstances then taken together arising from the French Revolution, from the approaching harmony and reciprocal interest of the two nations, the abolition of the court intrigue on both sides, and the progress of knowledge in the science of government, the annual expenditure might be put back to £1,500,000, viz. Navy, £500,000. Army, £500,000. Expenses of government, £500,000. Total, £1,500,000. Even this sum is 6 times greater than the expenses of government are in America. Yet the civil internal government in England, I mean that administered by means of quarter sessions, juries, and assize, and which in fact is nearly the whole, and performed by the nation, is less expense upon the revenue than the same species and portion of government is in America. It is time that nations should be rational, and not be governed like animals for the pleasure of their riders. To read the history of kings, a man would be almost inclined to suppose that government consisted in stag hunting, and that every nation paid $1,000,000 a year to a huntsman. Man ought to have pride or shame enough to blush at being thus imposed upon, and when he feels his proper character, he will. Upon all subjects of this nature, there is often passing in the mind a train of ideas he has not yet accustomed himself to encourage and communicate. Restrained by something that puts on the character of prudence, he acts the hypocrite upon himself as well as to others. It is, however, curious to observe how soon this spell can be dissolved. A single expression, boldly conceived and uttered, will sometimes put a whole company into their proper feelings, and whole nations are acted on in the same manner. As to the offices of which any civil government may be composed, it matters but little by what names they are described. In the routine of business, as before observed, whether a man be styled a president, a king, an emperor, a senator, or anything else, it is impossible that any service he can perform can merit from a nation more than £10,000 a year; and as no man should be paid beyond his services, so every man of a proper heart will not accept more. Public money ought to be touched with the most scrupulous consciousness of honour. It is not the produce of riches only, but of the hard earnings of labour and poverty. It is drawn even from the bitterness of want and misery. Not a beggar passes or perishes in the streets whose mite is not in that mass. Were it possible that the Congress of America could be so lost to their duty and to the interest of their constituents as to offer General Washington as President of America $1,000,000 a year, he would not, and he could not accept it. His sense of honour is of another kind. It has cost England almost 70 millions sterling to maintain a family imported from abroad, of very inferior capacity to thousands in the nation, and scarcely a year has passed that has not produced some new mercenary application. Even the physicians' bills have been sent to the public to be paid. No wonder that jails are crowded and taxes and poor rates increased. Under such systems nothing is to be looked for but what has already happened, and as to reformation, whenever it come, it must be from the nation and not from the government. To show that the sum of £500,000 is more than sufficient to defray all the expenses of the government, exclusive of navies and armies, the following estimate is added for any country of the same extent as England. In the first place, 300 representatives fairly elected are sufficient for all the purposes to which legislation can apply, and preferable to a larger number. They may be divided into 2 or 3 houses, or meet in one, as in France, or in any manner a constitution shall direct. As representation is always considered in free countries as the most honourable of all stations, the allowance made to it is merely to defray the expense which the representatives incur by that service, and not to it as an office. If an allowance at the rate of £500 per annum be made to every representative, deducting for non-attendance, the expense, if the whole number attended for 6 months each year, would be £7,500. The official departments cannot reasonably exceed the following number, with the salaries annexed: 3 offices at £10,000 each, £30,000. 10 ditto at £5,000 each, £50,000. 20 ditto at £2,000 each, £40,000. 40 ditto at £1,000 each, £40,000. 200 ditto at £500 each, £100,000. 300 ditto at £200 each, £60,000. 500 ditto at £100 each, £50,000. 700 ditto at £75 each, £52,500. Total £497,500. If a nation choose, it can deduct 4% from all offices and make one of 20,000 per annum. All revenue officers are paid out of the moneys they collect, and therefore are not in this estimation. The foregoing is not offered as an exact detail of offices, but to show the number of rate of salaries which £500,000 will support, and it will on experience be found impracticable to find business sufficient to justify even this expense. As to the manner in which office business is now performed, the chiefs in several offices, such as the post office, and certain offices in the exchequer, etc., do little more than sign their names 3 or 4 times a year, and the whole duty is performed by underclerks. Taking therefore 1,500,000 as a sufficient peace establishment for all the honest purposes of government, which is £300,000 more than the peace establishment in the profligate and prodigal times of Charles II. Notwithstanding, as has been already observed, the pay and salaries of the army, navy, and revenue officers continue the same as at that period, there will remain a surplus of upwards of 6 millions out of the present current expenses. The question then will be how to dispose of this surplus. Whoever has observed the manner in which trade and taxes twist themselves together must be sensible of the impossibility of separating them suddenly. First, because the articles now on hand are already charged with the duty, and the reduction cannot take place on the present stock. Secondly, because on all those articles on which the duty is charged in the gross, such as per barrel, hogshead, hundredweight, or ton, the abolition of the duty does not admit of being divided down so as fully to relieve the consumer who purchases by the pint or the pound. The last duty laid on strong beer and ale was 3 shillings per barrel, which, if taken off, would lessen the purchase only half a farthing per pint, and consequently would not reach to practical relief. This being the condition of a great part of the taxes, it will be necessary to look for such others as are free from this embarrassment, and where the relief will be direct and visible, and capable of immediate operation. In the first place, then, the poor rates are a direct tax which every housekeeper feels, and who knows also to a farthing the sum which he pays. The national amount of the whole of the poor rates is not positively known, but can be procured. Sir John Sinclair, in his History of the Revenue, has stated it at £2,100,587, a considerable part of which is expended in litigations, in which the poor, instead of being relieved, are tormented. The expense, however, is the same to the parish from whatever cause it arises. In Birmingham, the amount of poor rates is £14,000 a year. This, though a large sum, is moderate compared with the population. Birmingham is said to contain 70,000 souls, and on a proportion of 70,000 to £14,000 poor rates, the national amount of poor rates, taking the population of England as 7 millions, would be but £1,400,000. It is therefore most probable that the population of Birmingham is overrated. £14,000 is the proportion upon 50,000 souls, taking 2 millions of poor rates as the national amount. Be it, however, what it may, it is no other than the consequence of excessive burthen of taxes, for at the time when the taxes were very low, the poor were able to maintain themselves, and there were no poor rates. In the present state of things, a labouring man, with a wife, or 2 or 3 children, does not pay less than between £7 and £8 a year in taxes. He is not sensible of this, because it is disguised to him in the articles which he buys, and he thinks only of their dearness. But as the taxes take from him at least a 4th part of his yearly earnings, he is consequently disabled from providing for a family, especially if himself or any of them are afflicted with sickness. The first step, therefore, of practical relief would be to abolish the poor rates entirely, and in lieu thereof to make a remission of taxes to the poor of double the amount of the present poor rates, viz. 4 millions annually out of the surplus taxes. By this measure the poor would be benefited 2 millions, and the housekeepers 2 millions. This alone would be equal to a reduction of 120 millions of the national debt, and consequently equal to the whole expense of the American war. It will then remain to be considered which is the most effectual mode of distributing this remission of 4 millions. End of Part Second, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe, Part 3 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Section 32 of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2nd, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 4 of 7. It is easily seen that the poor are generally composed of large families of children and old people past their labour. If these 2 classes are provided for, the remedy will so far reach to the full extent of the case that what remains will be incidental, and in a great measure fall within the compass of benefit clubs, which, though of humble invention, merit to be ranked among the best of modern institutions. Admitting England to contain 7 millions of souls, if 1/5 thereof are of that class of poor which need support, the number will be 1,400,000. Of this number, 140,000 will be aged poor, as will be hereafter shown, and for which a distinct provision will be proposed. There will then remain 1,260,000, which, at 5 souls to each family, amount to 252,000 families, rendered poor from the expense of children and the weight of taxes. The number of children under 14 years of age in each of those families will be found to be about 5 to every 2 families, some having 2 and others 3, some 1 and others 4, some none and others 5, but it rarely happens that more than 5 are under 14 years of age, and after this age they are capable of service or of being apprenticed. Allowing 5 children under 14 years to every 2 families, the number of children will be 630,000. The number of parents, were they all living, would be 504,000. It is certain that if the children are provided for, the parents are relieved of consequence, because it is from the expense of bringing up children that their poverty arises. Having thus ascertained the greatest number that can be supposed to need support on account of young families, I proceed to the mode of relief or distribution, which is to pay as a remission of taxes to every poor family out of the surplus taxes, and in room of poor rates, £4 a year for every child under 14 years of age, enjoining the parents of such children to send them to school, to learn reading, writing, and common arithmetic, the ministers of every parish, of every denomination, to certify jointly to an office for that purpose that this duty is performed. The amount of this expense will be for 630,000 children at £4 per annum each, £2,520,000. By adopting this method, not only the poverty of the parents will be relieved, but ignorance will be banished from the rising generation, and the number of poor will hereafter become less, because their abilities, by the aid of education, will be greater. Many a youth with good natural genius, who is apprenticed to a mechanical trade, such as a carpenter, joiner, millwright, shipwright, blacksmith, etc., is prevented getting forward the whole of his life from the want of a little common education when a boy. I now proceed to the case of the aged. I divide age into two classes. First, the approach of age, beginning at 50. Secondly, old age, commencing at 60. At 50, though the mental faculties of man are in full vigour, and his judgment better than at any preceding date, the bodily powers for laborious life are on the decline. He cannot bear the same quantity of fatigue as at an earlier period. He begins to earn less, and is less capable of enduring wind and weather, and in those more retired employments where much sight is required, he fails apace, and sees himself, like an old horse, beginning to be turned adrift. At 60, his labour ought to be over, at least from direct necessity. It is painful to see old age working itself to death in what are called civilized countries for daily bread. To form some judgment of the number of those above 50 years of age, I have several times counted the persons I met in the streets of London, men, women, and children, and have generally found that the average is about 1 in 16 or 17. If it be said that aged persons do not come much into the streets, so neither do infants, and a great proportion of grown children are in schools and in workshops as apprentices. Taking then 16 for a divisor, the whole number of persons in England of 50 years and upwards, of both sexes, rich and poor, will be 420,000. The persons to be provided for out of this gross number will be husbandmen, common labourers, journeymen of every trade, and their wives, sailors, and disbanded soldiers, worn-out servants of both sexes, and poor widows. There will be also a considerable number of middling tradesmen, who, having lived decently in the former part of life, begin as age approaches to lose their business, and at last fall to decay. Besides these, there will be constantly thrown off from the revolutions of that wheel which no man can stop nor regulate, a number from every class of life connected with commerce and adventure. To provide for all those accidents, and whatever else may befall, I take the number of persons who, at one time or other of their lives, after 50 years of age, may feel it necessary or comfortable to be better supported than they can support themselves, and that not as a matter of grace and favour, but of right. At 1/3 of the whole number, which is 140,000, as stated in a previous page, and for whom a distinct provision was proposed to be made. If there be more, society, notwithstanding the show and pomposity of government, is in a deplorable condition in England. Of this 140,000, I take 1/2, 70,000, to be of the age of 50 and under 60, and the other half to be 60 years and upwards. Having thus ascertained the probable proportion of the number of aged persons, I proceed to the mode of rendering their condition comfortable, which is to pay to every such person of the age of 50 years and until he shall arrive at the age of 60, the sum of £6 per annum out of the surplus taxes, and £10 per annum during life after the age of 60, the expense of which will be 70,000 persons at £6 per annum, £420,000, 70,000 persons at £10 per annum, 700,000, total £1,120,000. This support, as already remarked, is not of the nature of a charity but of a right. Every person in England, male and female, pays on an average in taxes £2 8 shillings and sixpence per annum from the day of his or her birth, and if the expense of collection be added, he pays £2 11 shillings and sixpence. Consequently, at the end of 50 years, he has paid £128 15 shillings, and at 60, £154 10 shillings. Converting, therefore, his or her individual tax in a tontine, the money he shall receive after 50 years is but little more than the legal interest of the net money he has paid. The rest is made up from those whose circumstances do not require them to draw such support, and the capital in both cases defrays the expenses of government. It is on this ground that I have extended the probable claims to 1/3 of the number of aged persons in the nation. Is it then better that the lives of 140,000 aged persons be rendered comfortable, or that £1 million a year of public money be expended on any one individual, and him often of the most worthless or insignificant character? Let reason and justice, let honour and humanity, let even hypocrisy, sycophancy, and Mr. Burke, let George, let Louis, Leopold, Frederick, Catherine, Cornwallis, or Tippoo Saib answer the question. The sum thus remitted to the poor will be 252,000 poor families, containing 630,000 children, £2,520,000. To 140,000 aged persons, £1,120,000. Total £3,640,000. There will then remain £360,000 out of the 4 millions, part of which may be applied as follows. After all the above cases are provided for, there will still be a number of families who, though not properly of the class of poor, yet find it difficult to give education to their children, and such children, under such a case, would be in a worse condition than if their parents were actually poor. A nation, under a well-regulated government, should permit none to remain uninstructed. It is monarchical and aristocratical government only that requires ignorance for its support. Suppose, then, 400,000 children to be in this condition, which is a greater number than ought to be supposed after the provisions already made. The method will be to allow for each of those children 10 shillings a year for the expense of schooling for 6 years each, which will give them 6 months' schooling each year, and ½ a crown a year for paper and spelling books. The expense of this will be annually £250,000. There will then remain £110,000. Notwithstanding the great modes of relief which the best instituted and best principled government may devise, there will be a number of smaller cases which it is good policy as well as beneficence in a nation to consider. Were 20 shillings to be given immediately on the birth of a child to every woman who should make the demand, and none will make it whose circumstances do not require it, it might relieve a great deal of instant distress. There are about 200,000 births yearly in England, and if claimed by 1/4, the amount would be £50,000, and 20 shillings to every new married couple who should claim in like manner. This would not exceed the sum of £20,000. Also, £20,000 to be appropriated to defray the funeral expenses of persons who, travelling for work, may die at a distance from their friends. By relieving parishes from this charge, the sick stranger will be better treated. I shall finish this part of the subject with a plan adapted to the particular condition of a metropolis such as London. Cases are continually occurring in a metropolis different from those which occur in the country, and for which a different, or rather an additional, mode of relief is necessary. In the country, even in large towns, people have a knowledge of each other, and distress never rises to that extreme height it sometimes does in a metropolis. There is no such thing in the country as persons, in the literal sense of the word, starved to death, or dying with cold from the want of a lodging. Yet such cases, and others equally as miserable, happen in London. Many a youth comes up to London full of expectations, and with little or no money, and unless he get immediate employment, he is already half undone. And boys bred up in London without any means of a livelihood, and, as it often happens, of dissolute parents, are in a still worse condition, and servants, long out of place, are not much better off. In short, a world of little cases is continually arising, which busy or affluent life knows not of, to open the first door to distress. Hunger is not among the postponable wants, and a day, even a few hours, in such a condition is often the crisis of a life of ruin. These circumstances, which are the general cause of the little thefts and pilferings that lead to greater, may be prevented. There yet remain £20,000 out of the 4 millions of surplus taxes, which, with another fund hereafter to be mentioned, amounting to about £20,000 more, cannot be better applied than to this purpose. The plan will then be, first, to erect 2 or more buildings, or take some already erected, capable of containing at least 6,000 persons, and to have in each of these places as many kinds of employment as can be contrived, so that every person who shall come may find something which he or she can do. Secondly, to receive all who shall come, without enquiring who or what they are. The only condition to be, that for so much or so many hours' work each person shall receive so many meals of wholesome food, and a warm lodging, at least as good as a barrack. That a certain portion of what each person's work shall be worth shall be reserved, and given to him or her on their going away, and that each person shall stay as long or as short a time, or come as often as he choose, on these conditions. If each person stayed 3 months, it would assist by rotation 24,000 persons annually, though the real number at all times would be but 6,000. By establishing an asylum of this kind, such persons to whom temporary distresses occur would have an opportunity to recruit themselves, and be enabled to look out for better employment. Allowing that their labour paid but 1/2 the expense of supporting them, after reserving a portion of their earnings for themselves, the sum of £40,000 additional would defray all other charges for even a greater number than 6,000. The fund very properly convertible to this purpose, in addition to the £20,000 remaining of the former fund, will be the produce of the tax upon coals so iniquitously and wantonly applied to the support of the Duke of Richmond. It is horrid that any man, more especially at the price coals now are, should live on the distresses of a community, and any government permitting such an abuse deserves to be dismissed. This fund is said to be about £20,000 per annum. I shall now conclude this plan with enumerating the several particulars and then proceed to other matters. The enumeration is as follows. First, abolition of 2 millions poor rates. Secondly, provision for 250,000 poor families. Thirdly, education for 1,030,000 children. Fourthly, comfortable provision for 140,000 aged persons. Fifthly, donation of 20 shillings each for 50,000 births. Sixthly, donation of 20 shillings each for 20,000 marriages. Seventhly, allowance of £20,000 for the funeral expenses of persons travelling for work and dying at a distance from their friends. Eighthly, employment at all times for the casual poor in the cities of London and Westminster. By the operation of this plan, the poor laws, those instruments of civil torture, will be superseded, and the wasteful expense of litigation prevented. The hearts of the humane will not be shocked by ragged and hungry children, and persons of 70 and 80 years of age begging for bread. The dying poor will not be dragged from place to place to breathe their last, as a reprisal of parish upon parish. Widows will have a maintenance for their children, and not be carted away on the death of their husbands, like culprits and criminals, and children will no longer be considered as increasing the distresses of their parents. The haunts of the wretched will be known, because it will be to their advantage, and the number of petty crimes, the offspring of distress and poverty, will be lessened. The poor, as well as the rich, will then be interested in the support of government, and the cause and apprehension of riots and tumults will cease. Ye who sit in ease and solace yourselves in plenty, and such there are in Turkey and Russia, as well as in England, and who say to yourselves, quote, "Are we not well off?" unquote, have ye thought of these things? When ye do, ye will cease to speak and feel for yourselves alone. The plan is easy in practice. It does not embarrass trade by a sudden interruption in the order of taxes, but effects the relief by changing the application of them, and the money necessary for the purpose can be drawn from the excise collections, which are made 8 times a year in every market town in England. Having now arranged and concluded this subject, I proceed to the next. End of Part Second, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 4 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Section 33 of Rights of Man, by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2nd, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 5 of 7. Taking the present current expenses at 7 millions and a half, which is the least amount they are now at, there will remain, after the sum of 1 million and a half be taken for the new current expenses, and 4 millions for the before mentioned service, the sum of 2 millions, part of which to be applied as follows. Though fleets and armies, by an alliance with France, will, in a great measure, become useless, yet the persons who have devoted themselves to those services, and have thereby unfitted themselves for other lines of life, are not to be sufferers by the means that make others happy. They are a different description of men from those who form or hang about a court. A part of the army will remain, at least for some years, and also of the navy, for which a provision is already made in the former part of this plan of 1 million, which is almost 500,000 more than the peace establishment of the army and navy in the prodigal times of Charles II. Suppose then 15,000 soldiers to be disbanded, and that an allowance be made to each of 3 shillings a week during life, clear of all deductions, to be paid in the same manner as the Chelsea College pensioners are paid, and for them to return to their trades and their friends, and also that an addition of 15,000 sixpences per week be made to the pay of the soldiers who shall remain. The annual expenses will be: to the pay of 15,000 disbanded soldiers at 3 shillings per week, £117,000. Additional pay to the remaining soldiers, 19,500. Suppose that the pay to the officers of the disbanded corps be the same amount as sum allowed to the men, 117,000. Total, £253,500. To prevent bulky estimations, admit the same sum to the disbanded navy as to the army, and the same increase of pay, £253,500. Total, £507,000. Every year some part of this sum of £500,000, I omit the odd £7,000 for the purpose of keeping the account unembarrassed, will fall in, and the whole of it in time, as it is on the ground of life annuities, except the increased pay of £29,000. As it falls in, part of the taxes may be taken off, and as for instance, when £30,000 fall in, the duty on hops may be wholly taken off, and as other parts fall in, the duties on candles and soap may be lessened, till at last they will totally cease. There now remains at least 1,5 million of surplus taxes. The tax on houses and windows is one of those direct taxes which, like the poor rates, is not confounded with trade, and when taken off, the relief will be instantly felt. This tax falls heavy on the middle class of people. The amount of this tax by the returns of 1788 was: houses and windows by the Act of 1766, £385,459, 11 shillings and 7 pence. By the Act B 1779, £130,739, 14 shillings and 5.5 pence. Total, £516,199, 6 shillings and a half pence. If this tax be struck off, there will then remain about 1 million of surplus taxes, and as it is always proper to keep a sum in reserve for incidental matters, it may be best not to extend reductions further in the first instance, but to consider what may be accomplished by other modes of reform. Among the taxes most heavily felt is the commutation tax. I shall therefore offer a plan for its abolition, by substituting another in its place, which will effect 3 objects at once. 1. That of removing the burthen to where it can best be borne. 2. Restoring justice among families by a distribution of property. 3. Extirpating the overgrown influence arising from the unnatural law of primogeniture, which is one of the principal sources of corruption at elections. The amount of commutation tax by the returns of 1788 was £771,657. When taxes are proposed, the country is amused by the plausible language of taxing luxuries. One thing is called a luxury at one time, and something else at another. But the real luxury does not consist in the article, but in the means of procuring it, and this is always kept out of sight. I know not why any plant or herb of the field should be a greater luxury in one country than another, but an overgrown estate in either is a luxury at all times, and as such is the proper object of taxation. It is therefore right to take those kind tax-making gentlemen up on their own word, and argue on the principle themselves have laid down, that of taxing luxuries. If they or their champion Mr. Burke, who I fear is growing out of date like the man in armour, can prove that an estate of 20, 30 or 40,000 pounds a year is not a luxury, I will give up the argument. Admitting that any annual sum, say for instance £1,000, is necessary or sufficient for the support of a family, consequently the second thousand is of the nature of a luxury, the third still more so, and by proceeding on we shall at last arrive at a sum that may not improperly be called a prohibitable luxury. It would be impolitic to set bounds to property acquired by industry, and therefore it is right to place the prohibition beyond the probable acquisition to which industry can extend. But there ought to be a limit to property or the accumulation of it by bequest. It should pass in some other line. The richest in every nation have poor relations, and those often very near in consanguinity. The following table of progressive taxation is constructed on the above principles, and as a substitute for the commutation tax. It will reach the point of prohibition by a regular operation, and thereby supersede the aristocratical law of primogeniture. Table 1. A tax on all estates of the clear yearly value of £50, after deducting the land tax and up to £500, 3 pence per pound. From £500 to £1,000, 6 pence. On the second thousand, 9 pence. On the third, 1 shilling. On the fourth, 1 shilling and sixpence. On the fifth, 2 shillings. On the sixth, 3 shillings. On the seventh, 4 shillings. On the eighth, 5 shillings. On the ninth, 6 shillings per pound. On the 10th, 7 shillings. On the 11th, 8 shillings. On the 12th, 9 shillings. On the 13th, 10 shillings. On the 14th, 11 shillings. On the 15th, 12 shillings. On the 16th, 13 shillings. On the 17th, 14 shillings. On the 18th, 15 shillings. On the 19th, 16 shillings. On the 20th, 17 shillings. On the 21st, 18 shillings. On the 22nd, 19 shillings. On the 23rd, 20 shillings. The foregoing table shows the progression per pound on every progressive thousand. The following table shows the amount of the tax on every thousand separately, and in the last column the total amount of all the separate sums collected. An estate of £50 per annum at 3 pence per pound pays 12 shillings and sixpence. 100, £1 5 shillings. 200, £2 10 shillings. 300, £3 15 shillings. 400, £5. 500, £7 5 shillings. After £500, the tax of 6 pence per pound takes place on the second £500. Consequently, an estate of £1,000 per annum pays £21 15 shillings, and so on. For the first £500 at 3 pence per pound, £7 5 shillings. Second 500 at 6 pence per pound, £14 10 shillings. Total amount £21 15 shillings. Second 1000 at 9 pence per pound, £37 11 shillings. Total amount £59 5 shillings. Third 1000 at 1 shilling per pound, £50. Total amount £109 5 shillings. Fourth 1000 at 1 shilling and sixpence per pound, £75. Total amount £184 5 shillings. Fifth 1000 at 2 shillings per pound, £100. Total amount £284 5 shillings. Sixth 1000 at 3 shillings per pound, £150. Total amount £434 5 shillings. Seventh 1000 at 4 shillings per pound, £200. Total amount £634 5 shillings. Eighth 1000 at 5 shillings per pound, £250. Total amount £880 5 shillings. Ninth 1,000 at 6 shillings per pound, £300, total amount £1,100 and 5 shillings. 10th 1,000 at 7 shillings per pound, £350, total amount £1,530 and 5 shillings. 11th 1,000 at 8 shillings per pound, £400, total amount £1,930 and 5 shillings. 12th 1,000 at 9 shillings per pound, £450, total amount £2,380 and 5 shillings. 13th 1,000 at 10 shillings per pound, 500, total amount £2,880 and 5 shillings. 14th 1,000 at 11 shillings per pound, 550, total amount £3,430 and 5 shillings. 15th 1,000 at 12 shillings per pound, £600, total amount £4,030 and 5 shillings. 16th 1,000 at 13 shillings per pound, 650, total amount £4,680 and 5 shillings. 17th 1,000 at 14 shillings per pound, 700, total amount £5,380 and 5 shillings. 18th 1,000 at 15 shillings per pound, 750, total amount £6,130 and 5 shillings. 19th 1,000 at 16 shillings per pound, 800, total amount £6,930 and 5 shillings. 20th 1,000 at 17 shillings per pound, 850, total amount £7,780 and 5 shillings. 21st 1,000 at 18 shillings per pound, 900, total amount £8,680 and 5 shillings. 22nd 1,000 at 19 shillings per pound, £950, total amount £9,630 and 5 shillings. 23rd 1,000 at 20 shillings per pound, 1,000, total amount £10,630 and 5 shillings. At the 23rd 1,000 the tax becomes 20 shillings in the pound, and consequently every 1,000 beyond that sum can produce no profit but by dividing the estate. Yet, formidable as this tax appears, it will not, I believe, produce so much as the commutation tax. Should it produce more, it ought to be lowered to that amount upon estates under 2,000 or 3,000 a year. On small and middling estates it is lighter, as it is intended to be, than the commutation tax. It is not till after 7,000 or 8,000 a year that it begins to be heavy. The object is not so much the produce of the tax as the justice of the measure. The aristocracy has screened itself too much, and this serves to restore a part of the lost equilibrium. As an instance of its screening itself, it is only necessary to look back to the first establishment of the excise laws at what is called the Restoration, or the coming of Charles II. The aristocratical interest then in power commuted the feudal services itself was under by laying a tax on beer brewed for sale. That is, they compounded with Charles for an exemption from those services for themselves and their heirs by a tax to be paid by other people. The aristocracy do not purchase beer brewed for sale, but brew their own beer free of the duty, and if any commutation at that time were necessary, it ought to have been at the expense of those for whom the exemptions from those services were intended, instead of which it was thrown on an entirely different class of men. But the chief object of this progressive tax, besides the justice of rendering taxes more equal than they are, is, as already stated, to extirpate the overgrown influence arising from the unnatural law of primogeniture, and which is one of the principal sources of corruption at elections. It would be attended with no good consequences to inquire how such vast estates as 30, 40, or 50,000 a year could commence, and that at a time when commerce and manufacturers were not in a state to admit of such acquisitions. Let it be sufficient to remedy the evil by putting them in a condition of descending again to the community by the quiet means of apportioning them among all the heirs and heiresses of those families. This will be more necessary because hitherto the aristocracy have quartered their younger children and connections upon the public in useless posts, places, and offices, which when abolished will leave them destitute, unless the law of primogeniture be also abolished or superseded. A progressive tax will, in a great measure, affect this object, and that as a matter of interest to the parties most immediately concerned, as will be seen by the following table, which shows the net produce upon every estate after subtracting the tax. By this it will appear that after an estate exceeds 13 or 14,000 a year, the remainder produces but little profit to the holder, and consequently will pass either to the younger children or to other kindred. Table 3, showing the net produce of every estate from £1,000 to £23,000 a year. Number of thousand per annum, £1,000. Total tax subtracted, £21. Net produce, £979. 2,000, 59, 1,941. 3,000, 109, 2,891. 4,000, 184, 3,816, 5,000, 284, 4,716, 6,000, 434, 5,566, 7,000, 634, 6,366, 8,000, 880, 7,120, 9,000, 1,100, 7,900, 10,000, 1,530, 8,470, 11,000, 1,930, 9,070, 12,000, 2,380, 9,620, 13,000, 2,880, 10,120. Number of thousand per annum, 14,000. Total tax subtracted, 3,430. Net produce, 10,570. 15,000, 4,030, 10,970. 16,000, 4,680, 11,320. 17,000, 5,380, 11,620, 18,000, 6,130, 11,870, 19,000, 6,930, 12,170, 20,000, 7,780, 12,220, 21,000, 8,680, 12,320, 22,000, 9,630, 12,370, 23,000, 10,630, 12,370. The odd shillings are dropped in this table. According to this table, an estate cannot produce more than £12,370 clear of the land tax and the progressive tax, and therefore the dividing such estates will follow as a matter of family interest. An estate of £23,000 a year divided into 5 estates of £4,000 each and one of 3 will be charged only £1,129, which is but 5%, but if held by one possessor will be charged £10,630. Although an inquiry into the origin of those estates be unnecessary, the continuation of them in their present state is another subject. It is a matter of national concern. As hereditary estates, the law has created the evil, and it ought also to provide the remedy. Primogeniture ought to be abolished, not only because it is unnatural and unjust, but because the country suffers by its operation. By cutting off, as before observed, the younger children from their proper portion of inheritance, the public is loaded with the expense of maintaining them, and the freedom of elections violated by the overbearing influence which this unjust monopoly of family property produces. Nor is this all. It occasions a waste of national property. A considerable part of the land of the country is rendered unproductive by the great extent of parks and chases which this law serves to keep up, and this at a time when the annual production of grain is not equal to the national consumption. In short, the evils of the aristocratical system are so great and numerous, so inconsistent with everything that is just, wise, natural, and beneficent, that when they are considered, there ought not to be a doubt that many who are now classed under that description will wish to see such a system abolished. What pleasure can they derive from contemplating the exposed condition and almost certain beggary of their younger offspring? Every aristocratical family has an appendage of family beggars hanging round it, which in a few ages or a few generations are shook off, and console themselves with telling their tale in almshouses, workhouses, and prisons. This is the natural consequence of aristocracy. The peer and the beggar are often of the same family. One extreme produces the other. To make one rich, many must be made poor. Neither can the system be supported by other means. End of Part 2. Chapter 5. Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 5 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Section 34 of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 6 of 7. There are two classes of people to whom the laws of England are particularly hostile, and those the most helpless: younger children and the poor. Of the former I have just spoken. Of the latter I shall mention one instance out of the many that might be produced, and with which I shall close this subject. Several laws are in existence for regulating and limiting workmen's wages. Why not leave them as free to make their own bargains as the lawmakers are to let their farms and houses? Personal labour is all the property they have. Why is that little and the little freedom they enjoy to be infringed? But the injustice will appear stronger if we consider the operation and effect of such laws. When wages are fixed by what is called a law, the legal wages remain stationary, while everything else is in progression. And as those who make that law still continue to lay on new taxes by other laws, they increase the expense of living by one law and take away the means by another. But if these gentlemen lawmakers and tax-makers thought it right to limit the poor pittance which personal labour can produce, and on which a whole family is to be supported, they certainly must feel themselves happily indulged in a limitation on their own part, of not less than 12,000 a year, and that a property they never acquired, nor probably any of their ancestors, and of which they have made never acquire so ill a use. Having now finished this subject, I shall bring the several particulars into one view, and then proceed to other matters. The first 8 articles mentioned earlier are: 1. Abolition of 2 millions poor rates. 2. provision for 252,000 poor families at the rate of £4 per head for each child under 14 years of age, which, with the addition of £250,000, provides also education for 1,030,000 children. 3. Annuity of £6 per annum each for all poor persons, decayed tradesmen and others, supposed 70,000 of the age of 50 years and until 60. 4. Annuity of £10 each for life for all poor persons, decayed tradesmen and others, supposed 70,000 of the age of 60 years. 5. Donation of 20 shillings each for 50,000 births. 6. Donation of 20 shillings each for 20,000 marriages. 7. Allowance of £20,000 for the funeral expenses of persons travelling for work and dying at a distance from their friends. 8. Employment at all times for the casual poor in the cities of London and Westminster. Second enumeration. 9. Abolition of the tax on houses and windows. 10. Allowance of 3 shillings per week for life to 15,000 disbanded soldiers, and a proportionate allowance to the officers of the disbanded corps. 11. Increase of pay to the remaining soldiers of £19,500 annually. 12. The same allowance to the disbanded navy and the same increase of pay as to the army. 13. Abolition of the commutation tax. 14. Plan of a progressive tax operating to extirpate the unjust and unnatural law of primogeniture and the vicious influence of the aristocratical system. There yet remains, as already stated, 1 million of surplus taxes. Some part of this will be required for circumstances that do not immediately present themselves, and such part as shall not be wanted will admit of a further reduction of taxes equal to that amount. Among the claims that justice requires to be made, the condition of the inferior revenue officers will merit attention. It is a reproach to any government to waste such an immensity of revenue in sinecures and nominal and unnecessary places and offices, and not allow even a decent livelihood to those on whom the labour falls. The salary of the inferior officers of the revenue has stood at the petty pittance of less than £50 a year for upwards of 100 years. It ought to be 70. About £120,000 applied to this purpose will put all those salaries in a decent condition. This was proposed to be done almost 20 years ago, but the Treasury Board, then in being, startled at it, as it might lead to similar expectations from the Army and Navy, and the event was that the King, or somebody for him, applied to Parliament to have his own salary raised at £100,000 a year, which being done, everything else was laid aside. With respect to another class of men, the inferior clergy, I forbear to enlarge on their condition. But all partialities and prejudices for or against different modes and forms of religion aside, common justice will determine whether there ought to be an income of £20 or £30 a year to one man, and of 10,000 to another. I speak on this subject with the more freedom, because I am known not to be a Presbyterian, and therefore the cant cry of court sycophants about church and meeting, kept up to amuse and bewilder the nation, cannot be raised against me. Ye simple men on both sides the question, do you not see through this courtly craft? If ye can be kept disputing and wrangling about church and meeting, ye just answer the purpose of every courtier, who lives the while on the spoils of the taxes and laughs at your credulity. Every religion is good that teaches man to be good, and I know of none that instructs him to be bad. All the before mentioned calculations suppose only 16 millions and a half of taxes paid into the exchequer, after the expense of collection and drawbacks at the Custom House and Excise Office are deducted. Whereas the sum paid into the exchequer is very nearly, if not quite, 17 millions. The taxes raised in Scotland and Ireland are expended in those countries, and therefore their savings will come out of their own taxes. But if any part be paid into the English exchequer, it might be remitted. This will not make £100,000 a year difference. There now remains only the national debt to be considered. In the year 1789, the interest, exclusive of the tontine, was £9,150,138. How much the capital has been reduced since that time, the minister best knows. But after paying the interest, abolishing the tax on houses and windows, the commutation tax and the poor rates, and making all the provisions for the poor, for the education of children, the support of the aged, the disbanded part of the army and navy, and increasing the pay of the remainder, there will be a surplus of 1 million. The present scheme of paying off the national debt appears to me, speaking as an indifferent person, to be an ill-concerted, if not a fallacious job. The burthen of the national debt consists not in its being so many millions or so many hundred millions, but in the quantity of taxes collected every year to pay the interest. If this quantity continues the same, the burthen of the national debt is the same to all intents and purposes, be the capital more or less. The only knowledge which the public can have of the reduction of the debt must be through the reduction of taxes for paying the interest. The debt, therefore, is not reduced 1 farthing to the public by all the millions that have been paid. And it would require more money now to purchase up the capital than when the scheme began. Digressing for a moment at this point, to which I shall return again, I look back to the appointment of Mr. Pitt as minister. I was then in America. The war was over, and though resentment had ceased, memory was still alive. When the news of the coalition arrived, though it was a matter of no concern to, I felt it as a man. It had something in it which shocked, by publicly sporting with decency, if not with principle. It was impudence in Lord North. It was a want of firmness in Mr. Fox. Mr. Pitt was at that time what may be called a maiden character in politics. So far from being hackneyed, he appeared not to be initiated into the first mysteries of court intrigue. Everything was in his favour. Resentment against the coalition served as friendship to him, and his ignorance of vice was credited for virtue. With the return of peace, commerce and prosperity would rise of itself, yet even this increase was thrown to his account. When he came to the helm, the storm was over, and he had nothing to interrupt his course. It required even ingenuity to be wrong, and he succeeded. A little time showed him the same sort of man as his predecessors had been. Instead of profiting by those errors which had accumulated a burthen of taxes unparalleled in the world, he sought, I might almost say, he advertised for enemies, and provoked means to increase taxation. Aiming at something, he knew not what, he ransacked Europe and India for adventures, and abandoning the fair pretensions he began with, he became the knight-errant of modern times. It is unpleasant to see character throw itself away. It is more so to see oneself deceived. Mr. Pitt had merited nothing, but he promised much. He gave symptoms of a mind superior to the meanness and corruption of courts. His apparent candour encouraged expectations, and the public confidence, stunned, wearied, and confounded by a chaos of parties, revived and attached itself to him. But mistaking, as he has done, the disgust of the nation against the coalition for merit in himself, he has rushed into measures which a man less supported would not have presumed to act. All this seems to show that change of ministers amounts to nothing. One goes out, another comes in, and still the same measures, vices, and extravagance are pursued. It signifies not who is minister. The defect lies in the system. The foundation and the superstructure of the government is bad. Prop it as you please, it continually sinks into court government, and ever will. I return, as I promised, to the subject of the national debt, that offspring of the Dutch Anglo Revolution and its handmaid, the Hanover succession. But it is now too late to inquire how it began. Those to whom it is due have advanced the money, and whether it was well or ill spent, or pocketed, is not their crime. It is, however, easy to see that as the nation proceeds in contemplating the nature and principles of government, and to understand taxes and make comparisons between those of America, France, and England, it will be next to impossible to keep it in the same torpid state it has hitherto been. Some reform must, from the necessity of the case, soon begin. It is not whether these principles press with little or much force in the present moment. They are out. They are abroad in the world, and no force can stop them. Like a secret told, they are beyond recall, and he must be blind indeed that does not see that a change is already beginning. 9 millions of dead taxes is a serious thing. And this not only for bad, but in a great measure for foreign government. By putting the power of making war into the hands of the foreigners who came for what they could get, little else was to be expected than what has happened. Reasons are already advanced in this work, showing that whatever the reforms in the taxes may be, they ought to be made in the current expenses of government, and not in the part applied to the interest of the national debt. By remitting the taxes of the poor, they will be totally relieved, and all discontent will be taken away. And by striking off such of the taxes as are already mentioned, the nation will more than recover the whole expense of the mad American war. There will then remain only the national debt as a subject of discontent, and in order to remove, or rather to prevent this, it would be good policy in the stockholders themselves to consider it as property, subject like all other property, to bear some portion of the taxes. It would give it to both popularity and security, and as a great part of its present inconvenience is balanced by the capital which it keeps alive, a measure of this kind would so far add to that balance as to silence objections. This may be done by such gradual means as to accomplish all that is necessary with the greatest ease and convenience. Instead of taxing the capital, the best method would be to tax the interest by some progressive ratio, and to lessen the public taxes in the same proportion as the interest diminished. Suppose the interest was taxed 1/2 penny in the pound the first year, a penny more the second, and to proceed by a certain ratio to be determined upon, always less than any other tax upon property. Such a tax would be subtracted from the interest at the time of payment without any expense of collection. 1/2 penny in the pound would lessen the interest and consequently the taxes £20,000. The tax on wagons amounts to this sum, and this tax might be taken off the first year. The second year, the tax on female servants or some other of the like amount might also be taken off, and by proceeding in this manner, always applying the tax raised from the property of the debt towards its extinction, and not carry it to the current services, it would liberate itself. The stockholders, notwithstanding this tax, would pay less taxes than they do now. What they would save by the extinction of the poor rates and the tax on houses and windows, and the commutation tax, would be considerably greater than what this tax, slow but certain in its operation, amounts to. It appears to me to be prudence to look out for measures that may apply under any circumstances that may approach. There is at this moment a crisis in the affairs of Europe that requires it. Preparation now is wisdom. If taxation be once let loose, it will be difficult to reinstate it. Neither would the relief be so effectual as if it proceeded by some certain and gradual reduction. The fraud, hypocrisy, and imposition of governments are now beginning to be too well understood to promise them any long career. The farce of monarchy and aristocracy in all countries is following that of chivalry, and Mr. Burke is dressing aristocracy in all countries is following that of chivalry, and Mr. Burke is dressing for the funeral. Let it then pass quietly to the tomb of all other follies, and the mourners be comforted. The time is not very distant when England will laugh at itself for sending to Holland, Hanover, Zell, or Brunswick for men at the expense of £1,000,000 a year, who understood neither her laws, her language, nor her interest, and whose capacities would scarcely have fitted them for the office of a parish constable. If government could be trusted to such hands, it must be some easy and simple thing indeed, and materials fit for all the purposes may be found in every town and village in England. When it shall be said in any country in the world, my poor are happy, neither ignorance nor distress is to be found among them. My jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars, the aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive, the rational world is my friend, because I am the friend of its happiness. When these things can be said, then may that country boast its constitution and its government. Within the space of a few years we have seen two revolutions, those of America and France. In the former, the contest was long and the conflict severe. In the latter, the nation acted with such a consolidated impulse that, having no foreign enemy to contend with, the revolution was complete in power the moment it appeared. From both those instances it is evident that the greatest forces that can be brought into the field of revolutions are reason and common interest. Where these can have the opportunity of acting, opposition dies with fear, or crumbles away by conviction. It is a great standing which they have now universally obtained, and we may hereafter hope to see revolutions or changes in governments produced with the same quiet operation by which any measure, determinable by reason and discussion, is accomplished. When a nation changes its opinion and habits of thinking, it is no longer to be governed as before, but it would not only be wrong but bad policy to attempt by force what ought to be accomplished by reason. Rebellion consists in forcibly opposing the general will of a nation, whether by a party or by a government. There ought, therefore, to be in every nation a method of occasionally ascertaining the state of public opinion with respect to government. On this point, the old government of France was superior to the present government of England, because on extraordinary occasions recourse could be had what was then called the States General. But in England there are no such occasional bodies. And as to those who are now called representatives, a great part of them are mere machines of the court, placemen and dependents. I presume that though all the people of England pay taxes, not 1/100th part of them are electors, and the members of one of the Houses of Parliament represent nobody but themselves. There is therefore no power but the voluntary will of the people that has a right to act in any matter respecting a general reform, and by the same right that two persons can confer on such a subject, 1,000 may. The object in all such preliminary proceedings is to find out what the general sense of a nation is, and to be governed by it. If it prefer a bad or defective government to a reform, or choose to pay 10 times more taxes than there is any occasion for, it has a right so to do, and so long as the majority do not impose conditions on the minority different from what they impose upon themselves, though there may be much error, there is no injustice. Neither will the error continue long. Reason and discussion will soon bring things right, however wrong they may begin. By such a process no tumult is to be apprehended. The poor in all countries are naturally both peaceable and grateful in all reforms in which their interest and happiness is included. It is only by neglecting and rejecting them that they become tumultuous. The objects that now press on the public attention are the French Revolution and the prospect of a general revolution in governments. Of all nations in Europe, there is none so much interested in the French Revolution as England. Enemies for ages, and that at a vast expense, and without any national object, the opportunity now presents itself of amicably closing the scene and joining their efforts to reform the rest of Europe. By doing this, they will not only prevent the further effusion of blood and increase of taxes, but be in a condition of getting rid of a considerable part of their present burthens, as has been already stated. Long experience, however, has shown that reforms of this kind are not those which old governments wish to promote, and therefore it is to nations, and not to such governments, that these matters present themselves. In the preceding part of this work, I have spoken of an alliance between England, France, and America, for purposes that were to be afterwards mentioned. Though I have no direct authority on the part of America, I have good reason to conclude that she is disposed to enter into a consideration of such a measure, provided that the governments with which she might ally acted as national governments, and not as courts enveloped in intrigue and mystery. That France, as a nation and a national government, would prefer an alliance with England is a matter of certainty. Nations, like individuals who have long been enemies without knowing each other or knowing why, become the better friends when they discover the errors and impositions under which they had acted. Admitting, therefore, the probability of such a connection, I will state some matters by which such an alliance, together with that of Holland, might render service not only to the parties immediately concerned, but to all Europe. It is, I think, certain that if the fleets of England, France, and Holland were confederated, they could propose with effect a limitation to and a general dismantling of all the navies in Europe to a certain proportion to be agreed upon. First, that no new ship of war shall be built by any power in Europe, themselves included. Second, that all the navies now in existence shall be put back, supposed to 1/10 of their present force. This will save to France and England at least 2 millions sterling annually to each, and their relative force be in the same proportion as it is now. If men will permit themselves to think as rational beings ought to think, nothing can appear more ridiculous and absurd, exclusive of all moral reflections, than to be at the expense of building navies, filling them with men, and then hauling them into the ocean, to try which can sink each other fastest. Peace, which costs nothing, is attended with infinitely more advantage than any victory with all its expense. But this, though it best answers the purpose of nations, does not that of court governments, whose habited policy is pretence for taxation, places, and offices. It is, I think, also certain that the above confederated powers, together with that of the United States of America, can propose with effect to Spain the independence of South America and the opening those countries of immense extent and wealth to the general commerce of the world, as North America now is. With how much more glory and advantage to itself does a nation act when it exerts its powers to rescue the world from bondage and to create itself friends, than when it employs those powers to increase ruin, desolation, and misery. The horrid scene that is now acting by the English government in the East Indies is fit only to be told of Goths and Vandals, who, destitute of principle, robbed and tortured the world they were incapable of enjoying. The opening of South America would produce an immense field of commerce and a ready money market for manufacturers which the Eastern world does not. The East is already a country full of manufacturers, the importation of which is not only an injury to the manufacturers of England, but a drain upon its specie. The balance against England by this trade is regularly upwards of 500,000 annually sent out in the East India ships in silver, and this is the reason, together with German intrigue and German subsidies, that there is so little silver in England. But any war is harvest to such governments, however ruinous it may be to a nation. It serves to keep up deceitful expectations which prevent people from looking into the defects and abuses of government. It is the low here and the low there that amuses and cheats the multitude. Never did so great an opportunity offer itself to England and to all Europe, as is produced by the two revolutions of America and France. By the former, freedom has a national champion in the Western world, and by the latter in Europe. When another nation shall join France, despotism and bad government will scarcely dare to appear. To use a trite expression, the iron is becoming hot all over Europe. The insulted German and the enslaved Spaniard, the Russ and the Pole are beginning to think. The present age will hereafter merit to be called the age of reason, and the present generation will appear to the future as the Adam of a new world. When all the governments of Europe shall be established on the representative system, nations will become acquainted, and the animosities and prejudices fomented by the intrigue and artifice of courts will cease. The oppressed soldier will become a free man, and the tortured sailor, no longer dragged through the streets like a felon, will pursue his mercantile voyage in safety. It would be better that nations should continue the pay of their soldiers during their lives, and give them their discharge, and restore them to freedom and their friends, and cease recruiting, than retain such multitudes at the same expense, in a condition useless to society and to themselves. As soldiers have hitherto been treated in most countries, they might be said to be without a friend. Shunned by the citizen on an apprehension of their being enemies to liberty, and too often insulted by those who commanded them, their condition was a double oppression. But where genuine principles of liberty pervade a people, everything is restored to order, and the soldier, civilly treated, returns the civility. In contemplating revolutions, it is easy to perceive that they may arise from two distinct causes: the one to avoid or get rid of some great calamity, the other to obtain some great and positive good; and the two may be distinguished by the names of active and passive revolutions. In those which proceed from the former cause, the temper becomes incensed and soured, and the redress obtained by danger is too often sullied by revenge. But in those which proceed from the latter, the heart, rather animated than agitated, enters serenely upon the subject. Reason and discussion, persuasion and conviction become the weapons in the contest, and it is only when those are attempted to be suppressed that recourse is had to violence. When men unite in agreeing that a thing is good, could it be obtained, such for instance as relief from a burden of taxes and the extinction of corruption, the object is more than half accomplished. What they approve as the end, they will promote in the means. Will any man say, in the present excess of taxation, falling so heavily on the poor, that a remission of £5 annually of taxes to 104,000 poor families is not a good thing? Will he say that a remission of £7 annually to 100,000 other poor families, of £8 annually to another 100,000 poor families, and of £10 annually to 50,000 poor and widowed families are not good things? And to proceed a step further in this climax, will he say that to provide against the misfortunes to which all human life is subject, by securing £6 annually for all poor, distressed and reduced persons of the age of 50 until 60, and of £10 annually after 60 is not a good thing? Will he say that an abolition of 2 millions of poor rates to the housekeepers, and of the whole of the house and window light tax, and of the commutation tax is not a good thing? Or will he say that to abolish corruption is a bad thing? If, therefore, the good to be obtained be worthy of a passive, rational, and costless revolution, it would be bad policy to prefer waiting for a calamity that should force a violent one. I have no idea, considering the reforms which are now passing and spreading throughout Europe, that England will permit herself to be the last. And were the occasion and the opportunity quietly offer, it is better than to wait for a turbulent necessity. It may be considered as an honour to the animal faculties of man to obtain redress by courage and danger, but it is far greater honour to the rational faculties to accomplish the same object by reason, accommodation, and general consent. As reforms or revolutions, call them which you please, extend themselves among nations, those nations will form connections and conventions, and when a few are thus confederated, the progress will be rapid, till despotism and corrupt government be totally expelled, at least out of 2 quarters of the world, Europe and America. The Algerine piracy may then be commanded to cease, for it is only by the malicious policy of old governments against each other that it exists. End of Part Second, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe, Part 6 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Section 35 of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England. Part 2, Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 7 of 7. Throughout this work, various and numerous as the subjects are which I have taken up and investigated, there is only a single paragraph upon religion, viz., that every religion is good that teaches man to be good. I have carefully avoided to enlarge upon the subject, because I am inclined to believe that what is called the present ministry wish to see contentions about religion kept up, to prevent the nation turning its attention to subjects of government. It is as if they were to say, look that way, or any way but this. But as religion is very improperly made a political machine, and the reality of it is thereby destroyed, I will conclude this work with stating in what light religion appears to me. If we suppose a large family of children, who, on any particular day or particular circumstance, made it a custom to present to their parents some token of their affection and gratitude, each of them would make a different offering, and most probably in a different manner. Some would pay their congratulations in themes of verse and prose, by some little devices, as their genius dictated, or according to what they thought would please. And perhaps the least of all, not able to do any of those things, would ramble into the garden or the field and gather what it thought the prettiest flower it could find, though perhaps it might be but a simple weed. The parent would be more gratified by such a variety than if the whole of them had acted on a concerted plan, and each had made exactly the same offering. This would have the cold appearance of contrivance or the harsh one of control. But of all unwelcome things, nothing could more afflict the parent than to know that the whole of them had afterwards gotten together by the ears, boys and girls, fighting, scratching, reviling, and abusing each other about which was the best or the worst present. Why may we not suppose that the great Father of all is pleased with variety of devotion, and that the greatest offence we can act is that by which we seek to torment and render each other miserable? For my own part, I am fully satisfied that what I am now doing, with an endeavour to conciliate mankind, to render their condition happy, to unite nations that have hitherto been enemies, and to extirpate the horrid practice of war, and break the chains of slavery and oppression, is acceptable in his sight, and being the best service I can perform, I act it cheerfully. I do not believe that any two men, on what are called doctrinal points, think alike who think at all. It is only those who have not thought that appear to agree. It is in this case as with what is called the British Constitution. It has been taken for granted to be good, and encomiums have supplied the place of proof. But when the nation comes to examine into its principles and the abuses it admits, it will be found to have more defects than I have pointed out in this work and the former. As to what are called national religions, we may, with as much propriety, talk of national gods. It is either political craft or the remains of the pagan system, when every nation had its separate and particular deity. Among all the writers of the English church clergy who have treated on the general subject of religion, the present Bishop of Llandaff has not been excelled, and it is with much pleasure that I take this opportunity of expressing this token of respect. I have now gone through the whole of the subject, at least as far as it appears to me at present. It has been my intention, for the 5 years I have been in Europe, to offer an address to the people of England on the subject of government, if the opportunity presented itself before I returned to America. Mr. Burke has thrown it in my way, and I thank him. On a certain occasion 3 years ago, I pressed him to propose a national convention to be fairly elected for the purpose of taking the state of the nation into consideration. But I found that however strongly the parliamentary current was then setting against the party he acted with, their policy was to keep everything within that field of corruption and trust to accidents. Long experience had shown that parliaments would follow any change of ministers, and on this they rested their hopes and their expectations. Formerly, when divisions arose respecting governments, recourse was had to the sword, and a civil war ensued. That savage custom is exploded by the new system, and reference is had to national conventions. Discussion and the general will arbitrates the question, and to this private opinion yields with a good grace, and order is preserved uninterrupted. Some gentlemen have affected to call the principles on which this work and the former part of Rights of Man are founded a newfangled doctrine. The question is not whether those principles are new or old, but whether they are right or wrong. Suppose the former, I will show their effect by a figure easily understood. It is now towards the middle of February. Were I to take a turn into the country, the trees would present a leafless, wintry appearance. As people are apt to pluck twigs as they walk along, I perhaps might do the same, and by chance might observe that a single bud on that twig had begun to swell. I should reason, very unnaturally, or rather not reason at all, to suppose this was the only bud in England which had this appearance. Instead of deciding thus, I should instantly conclude that the same appearance was beginning or about to begin everywhere, And though the vegetable sleep will continue longer on some trees and plants than on others, and though some of them may not blossom for 2 or 3 years, all will be in leaf in the summer, except those which are rotten. What pace the political summer may keep with the natural, no human foresight can determine. It is, however, not difficult to perceive that the spring is begun. Thus wishing, as I sincerely do, freedom and happiness to all nations, I close the second part. End of part second. Chapter 5, Ways and Means of Improving the Condition of Europe. Part 7 of 7. Read by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England.